All right, so now that our front end is sending along the user's auth token with each and every request, the next thing that we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to add Firebase admin to our server so that it can start actually verifying to make sure that the auth token that our users send along is legit. So the first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to open up our server directory and we're going to install the Firebase admin package into there. So we're going to open up friend tracker server and we're going to say npm install Firebase admin. Okay. And while that's installing, we're going to have to go over to Firebase and get the credentials file that will basically allow our server to have admin level privileges on our project. So to do that, you might remember, we're going to go into our friend tracker project in the Firebase console. We're going to click on this little gear thing up in the top left-hand corner. We're going to go to users and permissions, and we're going to click on service accounts. And this is where we can download that credentials file. So I'm just going to say generate new private key, click this generate key button, and that will download the credentials JSON for us. So I'm going to copy and paste this over into my project. And I'm going to rename it now to credentials.json. And once you've done that, you're going to want to make sure that you add this to the gitignore file. So I'm just going to go into here and say credentials.json to prevent ourselves from accidentally committing this to GitHub and basically compromising our project's credentials. Okay, so now that we have those credentials, the next step is going to be to open up our server.js file. And inside here, we're going to basically set up Firebase admin with those credentials that we just downloaded. So in order to do that, we're just going to say import all as admin from Firebase admin. And we're also going to import our credentials by saying import credentials from ... credentials.json. And then we're going to initialize our Firebase admin with those credentials by saying admin.initializeApp. And inside here, we're going to say credential admin.credential.cert credentials, and that should be all we need to do to get Firebase admin up and running on our server. So now that we have that set up, what we're going to need to do next is basically in each and every one of our server endpoints, we're going to need to make sure that the user is who they say they are. Okay, so the way that we can do that, we're just going to use this friends endpoint as an example here. Since every request is sending along the auth token property along with its headers, we're going to start off each of our endpoints here by getting that auth token. And we'll say equals request.headers. And then we need to use the admin package to verify that that auth token is legit, as I said. So the way that we do that, in case you don't remember, is by saying const user equals await admin.auth.verify ID token, and we're going to pass that auth token as an argument to the verify ID token function. All right, so at this point we have the user. So essentially the only other thing that we're going to have to do in all of our endpoints is replace this hard-coded string, right, which is, the ID of the user that we manually created in Firebase. We're going to have to replace that with the ID of the user that we got from calling verify ID token. Now, just to be very clear about what this user object is, I'm actually going to change the name of this to auth user. Okay, and then basically what we'll do is just say auth user .uid. We're basically going to replace every string where we hard-coded the ID with that same kind of logic that we just did here. Okay, so that's how we convert over the endpoint for getting all of a user's friends. And what we could do is we could just copy and paste this logic basically throughout each of our endpoints, and that would work. However, it would be extremely repetitive. So what we're going to do instead is use a technique that I showed you earlier, and that is we're basically going to set up some express middleware that will take care of all of this for us, right? Because in addition to what we just did here, we're also going to need to check and make sure for each and every request that this auth token is valid in the first place, right? So that's going to involve adding a try-catch block, as well as a lot of other logic that would be extremely repetitive if we were to put that in all of our endpoints. we're going to add the middleware that I mentioned, and the way we're going to do that is by saying app.use, and the callback function for this middleware is going to be an async function with request, response, and next as arguments. Okay, and then inside of here, what we're going to do is basically the logic that we just saw here. We're going to get the auth token from the headers each time a request comes in. So const auth token equals request.headers. We're going to verify it by saying const auth user equals await admin.auth.verify ID token. And we're going to pass that auth token as an argument here. Okay, and then we're just going to add a try catch block around here in order to take care of what happens if the verify ID token function goes wrong. And basically, inside the catch block now, what we're going to do is we're just going to send back a 401 error, which basically means that the auth token either didn't exist or it wasn't valid. So we're going to say response.send status 401 inside of there. And inside the try block, if everything goes well, we're going to call next. Okay, so one question that comes up now is how do we actually get access to this auth user variable inside our endpoints? Well, you may remember from before that essentially what we can do is say request.authUser equals authUser. And what will happen now is now each of our endpoints that comes after this middleware function that we've defined, right? Essentially all of the functions that the middleware applies to have access to this request.authUser thing. So what we can do with this is instead of having to go through and say authUser blah 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 authUser.id, all we have to do is wherever we had the user's ID, we now just have to say request.authUser.id, and basically all of the logic is consolidated now inside this middleware. So what we're going to do is go through each of these. Okay, we have our friends. Let's do the same thing with our favorites. We're going to replace this ID with request.authUser.uid. Okay, same thing with our getFriendById. We're going to say if request.authUser.uid is not equal to friend.createdBy, then we want to send back this 403. Okay, and same thing down here. Request.authUser.uid. We'll do it here too. We're going to be setting that ID as the createdBy property when we create a new friend. So request.authUser.uid. And here as well, request.authUser.uid. And we're getting close to the end here. So this one too, request.authUser.uid. Request.authUser.uid here as well. And last but not least, inside our update users and update friend, we're going to replace this one last time with request.authUser.uid. Okay, request.authUser.uid. Okay, so hopefully by now you've really gotten it through your head that if we had to basically rewrite this logic inside each and every one of our endpoints, that would be a nightmare, right? It would get very difficult to maintain when we wanted to make a change to how we handle this sort of situation. Okay, so let's try this and see if it's working still with our front end. All right, what we're going to do is go over to our app. We're going to try refreshing it. Oops, let's make sure everything's running. I have a feeling that's the problem here. Yep, sure enough, we need to run our server. Make sure our front end is running as well. Looks like it is. And let's try this again. We're going to reload. And sure enough, all of our friends show up. Let's try doing some things like editing their info. Looks like that works. Let's try adding to favorites, removing from favorites. It looks like those work as well. Okay, yep, they work on this page too. Now, one thing that is not going to work is if we click on my profile, you're going to see that we're just stuck with this loading message here. Now, the reason that this is happening is because basically inside our front end, we're still making a hard-coded request using the user ID. You probably forgot that we did this. I did too when I was first writing out all of this code for my notes. So what we're going to do is basically we're going to search through our friend tracker front end for all of the places where we say /users. Here we'll just say /users. Okay, and that should take us to, yes, here we go. So there's only 2 places it looks like. As you can see, basically what we did from before is we copied and pasted the hard-coded MongoDB ID for our user into the actual request. So at this point, we're going to replace that with the current user's ID. And the way we're going to do that is basically by using the useUser hook that we created earlier. So what we're going to do, we're going to say const user, here we'll say is loading. And we'll have to change that to is loading user because we already have an is loading variable in here. And we're going to get the user as well. And this is going to be equal to use user. And once we have that, we're going to want to replace this here. We're going to say backticks and replace user ID inside of here. So users, user.uid. Same thing down here. We're going to replace this now with users user ID, user.uid that is. And really all we have to make sure of here now is that we only call load user info when we actually have this user ID. Otherwise, what you'll probably see is requests going to /users/undefined, or probably more likely you'll get an error for trying to access UID on a non-existent object. So all we have to do here is say if not is loading user and user exists, then we want to load user info, and as we learned before, we have to also include is loading user and user inside the dependencies for our effect. Okay, and for this update user info, that shouldn't be too big of a problem. If you really want to make sure, you can always put in some kind of fail-safe to make sure that this user exists before calling it, but in general, this thing won't actually be called ever if the user wasn't actually loaded. Okay, so anyway, let's go back to our application now and see if it works. Oops, it looks like we forgot to import useUser, so let's open up those files we just had open. Okay, we need useUser in here, import useUser from /hooks/useUser. Okay, we'll try refreshing this now. Go to my profile, and it looks like we're still getting something going wrong, so let's check our network tab. We're going to see network. If we try and refresh this, oops, let's go back to my profile here. We're going to see that it looks like some kind of error is happening because this request is pending. So let's go back and take a look at our server. Sure enough, an error showed up here. Let's take a look here. Argument passed in must be a buffer or string of blah, 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 blah. The reason for this is that we're trying to use inside our user route, that is. Here, let's open up our server and go down to where we load our user info. This user ID, if you remember, was actually the MongoDB ID, and what we want to use now is the Firebase auth ID. So we're going to actually change this now to user auth ID in this one, and where else are we using the user ID? Here we go, user auth ID. Okay, and basically we're just going to need to change the way that we use this a little bit. Instead of saying user ID, we're going to say user auth ID from request.params, and we're going to want to find our user by their ID property, which is not a MongoDB object ID. So we're going to say user auth ID there as well. Okay, and then let's go back down here to where we were updating our user. And for this, what we're going to do is same thing as before. We're going to switch to the ID property without the underscore. We're going to remove the object ID constructor from around the user ID, and we're going to rename this to user auth ID, both here and up at the top here. Oh, and I think I forgot to do this up at the top too, so we'll just need to say user auth ID. And back up here, we're going to need to say user auth ID. Okay, so let's give this another try. Hopefully this will work this time. Let's refresh. and go to my profile. And sure enough, it looks like our profile data is working. Let's try and edit it by clicking Edit My Profile Info. I'm just going to edit this slightly and click Save Changes. And sure enough, it looks like those updates are persisted. All right, now keep in mind that the key point of everything that we just did here with Firebase Auth and verifying the ID token, etc., is to make sure that users can only access their own resources. So if we have a user here and, their resources are in this box, and we have another user here and their resources are in this box, we want to prevent users from reaching over into other users' boxes and getting their information, right? We want to stop that from happening, and the way we do that is by using those auth token things that we've seen. And Firebase abstracts away a lot of that logic for us, right? Implementing authentication tokens is a topic for another time. But anyway, at this point, we have an application that makes sure that users can only access, modify, delete, etc., their own data, and all of that we did with Firebase Auth. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.